100%. And I couldn't agree more with everything you said there. I'm going to ask you a question that maybe somebody listening to this or a lot of parents probably ask on the initial phone call when they get on the phone with you and are trying to gather some information about the process. The big picture narrative for people, especially on the outside of the sport, is that the transfer portal has ruined high school recruiting, right? And obviously, there's pros and cons. It's a lot more at the Division I level, and those conversations that definitely come into play. What is kind of your perspective on that conversation, maybe easing a parent's concerns or maybe opening their mind up to, hey, it has changed the sport at the top of Power Four, but there's still thousands of schools that are fresh for opportunities for your son specifically to play college baseball.
Yeah, well, I say this to our players all the time, right? Like nobody cares about my opinion, but the fact of the matter is this is the landscape we're operating in. Um, Obviously, the high school player has been dramatically affected, over the last few years when it comes to the recruiting process. But having said that, look, every program in America is still recruiting high school players, right? Even at the top of the sport, the SEC, the ACC, the Power Four programs, they're recruiting high school players. So it's still occurring. Right, the most talented guys in America are ending up at the highest level of the sport. So we haven't seen anybody, at least to my knowing, um, you know, fully move on from recruiting high school players. So, there is a pathway to college baseball. It has just become more competitive because these classes are smaller as a result of smaller rosters. You also have guys getting to campus, whether it's NIL, taking them out of the draft, either on the back end, right, year four, right. Maybe traditionally somebody was signing for a mid-range bonus, but you know they're able to either equal or in some cases enhance their financial opportunity by staying on campus for a fourth year, or guys deciding to attend school because the financial prospects are so good over the course of a 3 year period. So there's definitely an effect there. Again, at the highest level of the sport, where the draft is a influence on roster decisions. But then again, it's that domino effect. But um, ultimately, I think this ties back to something we were saying earlier, Trevor. The biggest decisions you're making in the recruiting process really are the player development aspects of what you're doing, throughout the course of the calendar. And I think um, this is something that I think is not necessarily a good thing, but I think it has pulled players in a direction where it just requires more investment financially, yes, but a time investment to really um, physically develop, because you just have to be more prepared to step on campus day one. I think in a 40-man roster situation, the ability to recruit a few guys that are maybe a year or two away from helping you, it just doesn't happen anymore, particularly at the Division I level. And that's really where things need to, I think that the mindset needs to shift for players and families in terms of you really have to be, I don't want to say a complete player, but you have to be further along in your development from a physical standpoint, skill perspective, and then the game environment as well. The guys who were super toolsy but maybe couldn't put it together day in and day out between the white lines, like those guys are still, not as attractive in today's recruiting landscape, because we can go and get the kid who's been on a Division II or Division III roster for 2 years, who can do all of that, right? He just checks more boxes. So you really have to have all those elements, I think, in order to, at least at the Division I level right now, be a competitive recruit.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of want to let that simmer. If anybody's listening to this right now, go back 30 seconds, re listen to that. The floor of what you have to be to play college baseball is much higher. As roster sizes decrease, I
Absolutely.
can't emphasize this enough. You cannot take as much of a chance on 97's a stretch, 92 all over the place. Back in the day, if you had good stuff but you couldn't throw strikes, they could put you on ice, red shirt you, put you in a developmental track, and you're an ace by year 3 potentially. With roster sizes decreasing, with arm injuries being what they are, all the factors that are in play, we'd rather have a guy who throws 86 in the strike zone, because when we're down 7 on a Tuesday in some random town, we just need a guy to go out there to eat innings, right?
Sure.
Because we only have 34, right? And I know with DSAs it's a little tricky and things like that. So the developmental aspect, right? I always talk about this with, I always used to say it's not your grandfather's college baseball, right? The beauty of this
For
sport is you
sure.
could have a 90-mile-per-hour arm. I'm sure you've seen this, who ends up at a really good Division 3 school. When I was being recruited in 2015, if you threw 90, don't even worry about reaching out to Division 2 schools, right? Like,
Sure.
it was just so commonplace for those guys to be automatic Division 1 players because of how talented everybody is and raising the floor of what expectations are. So even if your cousin played at, I always use the example around here, NC State, and you feel like your son's a better player than said cousin, that doesn't mean he's even going to play Division 1 baseball in this landscape. How do you keep families open minded to understanding that the floor of what the expectations are of being able to be a rostered Division 1 player, and really a rostered even Division 3 player, has risen so much, to make sure expectations are set in stone so that people don't get just spending, I mean, time's valuable, where they're spending time going to camps, showcases, emailing the wrong level of coaches.
Sure. I think it's a lot of conversations like this, and just making sure there's an awareness from a parent player perspective in terms of what the landscape is like. Um, I think there's a lot of there's some bad information out there, but there's also a lot of good information out there for uh, recruits to get a sense of what they're going to encounter in the process, and then ultimately at the college level in the years ahead. Um, you know, for us, at least personally speaking on our end, it's why the evaluation is so critical. And being able to have a very candid conversation with players, and yeah, maybe the ceiling and the floor is a little bit more wide ranging than it was in the past because of all these different factors. But I still think you need to have a sense of really where the player is at the beginning of the conversation, and then what does that project to in years ahead, and what can you do from a advisory standpoint to benefit that player, right? And certain things need to be prioritized, right, based on that evaluation. Is it a strength deficit? Is it a physical, does he need to add more mass, right? Like, we talk about it quite frequently with younger high school players, but you don't see a lot of 160-pound guys playing Division 1 baseball right now, right? The sport's more physical than it's ever been before. So these are all things that, you need to be aware of, and ultimately players need to have a really good understanding of what the requirements are in order to best put themselves in a situation to get recruited. And then, like I said, I think it's just about being a more complete player in the recruiting process than ever before. And I think it's also access to information, right? Like those things necessarily weren't available to coaches in the past, but whether it's um, ability to consume, you know data, right, from a TrackMan or a Rapsodo, even the social media entity, and being able to pop a kid's name into Twitter and look at what their outings might have been like throughout the course of the summer. There's just so much more information for these guys to do a deep dive into players and really get a more complete sense. Rather than just the 3 outings that they've evaluated in person, and on their end, with the tough decisions that they have to make, it requires that attention to detail. And I think as a player, it puts a magnifying glass on everything that you do, and it's tough, right? Because I just look at like guys up here in the Northeast, for example, right? And let's use a hitter as an example, right? You show up in you know mid March and you got to start playing high school games in 40-degree weather, and the strike zone is uh, you know stretching
Chalk to
into
chalk.
the opposite batter's box and things of that nature. And, you look up and maybe some of the offensive numbers are down across the spring and just took you a little bit of time to get going. But that information's out there, right? And coaches are looking towards it to, again, make the most informed decision because, six-person high school class, and that's pretty commonplace at Division I right now. Um, it again, you can't take as much of a chance on guys, and it just puts a lot of emphasis on the player being prepared at all points in the calendar to, again, best position themselves for success in the process ahead.
Mhm. You hit on it a couple times there. You mentioned, coaches making decisions off of information gathered, data points, and things like that. One of the things you probably hear the most in the recruiting industry is my son doesn't check the metric box that schools are looking for, but they're a really good baseball player, right? And it's one of my favorite things to hear, because not that I roll my eyes at it, because I don't think all coaches recruit solely off of metrics like a lot of the private sector would have you believe. But metrics are valuable information, and data is information. And when we're making decisions, we want the most information as possible. Talk a little bit about how metrics go into your evaluation and how you guide parents and families through the process of being able to have their outreach be very important. And one of the things I specifically want you to hit on, because you said it to me one time and you probably don't even remember saying this, but it's turned a light bulb off in my brain, and it's stuck with me ever since. Size and strength is a metric as well, right? So even if your kid's
Sure.
really good and he's hitting 550 in high school baseball and he has great bat to ball and things like that, but if he's 5'6", 160 pounds, like you hit on at the beginning of that answer, how many kids that size play Division I baseball? So talk about the importance of metrics and coaches being able to make the best decision possible for them.
Yeah, I think, especially on the pitching side right now, right, data is becoming more prevalent in the recruiting process. Um, I think more times than not, when a coach is recruiting a pitcher in today's landscape, they're asking for data if it's available. Particularly for guys in our program, coaches know we have a track man. Like they want that information to be able to analyze what the arsenal looks like. Not saying that everything is being decided on those things. It's not professional baseball per se, where there are certain benchmarks that need to be met from an organizational standpoint in order to draft a guy or move him through the system. But I think you're looking for things that maybe you can't get from just evaluating a bullpen to see if there's outlier information that is going to separate that arm from the rest of the guys that you're recruiting. Positionally, I would say it's um, it's not as part of the conversation, but I always use the metrics as kind of a barrier to entry, right? Um, Again, not everybody's going to fit into a nice clean box, but most guys are going to meet certain benchmarks from a metric perspective at different levels of the sport, right? You look at guys who are going to play in the middle of the field at a top 50 program, they're usually 6'6", 6'8" runners, right? Um, so I think you use those to kind of organize your thinking and try and set the player up on a pathway towards programs that are going to be viable, right? Whether that's the 60 arm strength, some exit velocities, things of that nature, bat speed. But again, you then have to have those tools. And when we talk about the complete player, those have to translate into the game setting, right? Um, so I think that's most important on the position player side. But it's really about getting organized because, you know, from a strategic standpoint, as a player in a family, as you attack the recruiting process in today's world, you need to be more precise and calculated than ever before, because as these classes have shrunk, you can't fall back as much to a smaller Division I program because those spots have usually been taken, right? By the time you get to a period where you think you're now ready to be recruited by those schools. So you really need to go after the top targets based on the evaluation from day one and secure your opportunities. And I think that's imperative right now as a player and family. And if you don't have a good evaluation, and sometimes using again the metrics and the data helps kind of point you in that direction, you can get very lost, or you can get lost very easily, I should say, and ultimately you look up and a lot of opportunities passed you by because you were trying to play kind of above your means to a certain extent.
I think barrier for entry is such a great way to say that, just from my perspective on the former coach side of, you could go out and pitch to a sub 1 ERA, but if you're 68 to 72, there's
Right.
just a level that velocity doesn't play